There is a reason experienced rangers quietly warn people not to hike alone in places like this. It is not because the wilderness is cruel or because the mountains are evil. It is because when something goes wrong out here, there is often no one left to explain what happened. The Sawtooth Wilderness in central Idaho is one of those places. From a distance, it looks almost welcoming. Sharp granite peaks rise cleanly into the sky, their faces catching sunlight in a way that makes them look carved rather than formed. Alpine lakes sit perfectly still beneath them, reflecting the sky like mirrors. In photographs, it is beautiful in a way that feels almost unreal. But up close, the Sawtooths are something else entirely. The terrain is unforgiving. Trails vanish into fields of loose stone. Weather changes without warning. Snow can cling to shaded slopes even in the middle of summer. And scattered throughout the mountains are old forgotten mine shafts, vertical holes hidden beneath brush and shadow, relics of a different century, waiting silently for a single misstep. In August of 2016, a woman named Emily Carter drove straight toward this wilderness alone. 2 days earlier, she had posted about it online. It was a simple message, written casually, the kind of thing people scroll past without thinking twice. Emily wrote that she was planning to climb Thompson Peak, the highest point in Idaho, and that it was not a beginner's hike. She mentioned scrambling sections, exposure, and a long day on the mountain. At the end of the post, she added that if anyone wanted to join her, she still had room in her car. At the time, it read like an open invitation from someone excited to be outdoors. Later, it would be read very differently, because no one went with her. Emily Carter was 29 years old. She stood just under 5'7", lean and athletic, with the kind of posture that comes from spending years on uneven ground. She had a long, pale scar along the left side of her neck from a childhood surgery, and a black geometric tattoo that wrapped across her right shoulder blade. Both were visible when she wore tank tops, and both made her easy to recognize. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, which gave her the freedom to structure her life around the mountains. Friends described her as calm, focused, and intensely self-reliant. She was not reckless. She planned her hikes carefully, studied maps, checked weather reports, and carried proper gear. She had climbed dozens of peaks across the Pacific Northwest and the Rockies. Going alone was not unusual for her. But Thompson Peak was different. The route is long and complex, gaining thousands of feet in elevation over loose talus and steep granite. There is no single clear path near the summit. Only a series of choices, some safer than others. Most hikers attempt it in pairs or small groups, not because it cannot be done solo, but because mistakes at that elevation are often irreversible. Emily knew this. Her boyfriend Daniel Brooks knew it too. They had met 3 years earlier at a climbing gym in Boise. Daniel worked as a civil engineer, methodical by nature, cautious in a way that balanced Emily's constant hunger for higher ground. He admired her independence, but he worried about it as well. Thompson Peak, he would later tell investigators, had made him uneasy from the beginning. On the morning of August 14, 2016, Emily left their shared apartment before sunrise. She sent Daniel a text just before she pulled onto the highway. It was short and affectionate, nothing dramatic. She told him she loved him, that she would text when she was back at the car, and that he shouldn't wait up. Daniel replied almost immediately, telling her to be careful. That message would be the last one he ever received from her phone. By mid-morning, Emily signed the trail register at the Iron Creek trailhead. Other hikers would later remember seeing her, alone, confident, moving steadily upward with trekking poles and a dark backpack. The day was warm, but wildfire smoke from distant blazes hazed the sky, softening the sunlight and blurring the ridgelines. Emily was climbing into a landscape where distances are deceptive and time moves differently. She reached the upper basin by early afternoon. Several hikers reported seeing her near the summit between 2 and 3 o'clock. One remembered sharing a brief conversation with her while eating lunch among the rocks. Another noticed the scar on her neck and the tattoo on her shoulder as she adjusted her pack. And then came the detail that would haunt investigators. At least 2 witnesses independently told search and rescue teams that Emily did not descend the standard route. Instead of heading back toward the basin and the trail that led to her car, she was seen moving west, toward steeper terrain, away from the established descent, and toward areas marked on maps with little more than blank space. At the time, no one stopped her. Experienced hikers sometimes choose alternate routes. Sometimes they do it for challenge, sometimes for curiosity, and sometimes they make one decision too many. By 6 o'clock that evening, Daniel Brooks was waiting for her message. It never came. Emily Carter did not grow up dreaming about mountains. She grew up learning how to endure quiet. She was raised in a small town outside Spokane, the kind of place where winters feel longer than they should, and people learn early how to keep to themselves. Her parents worked long hours. Her father drove freight trucks across state lines. Her mother managed a medical billing office and often came home exhausted, emotionally distant in ways Emily would only understand years later. Emily learned independence not as a choice, but as a necessity. At the age of 11, she underwent surgery to remove a benign growth near her neck. The procedure saved her life, but it left a scar that never fully faded. Children noticed it immediately. Questions came first, then teasing, then silence. Emily responded by withdrawing inward, developing a private resilience that would define the rest of her life. She discovered hiking in her late teens almost by accident. A high school science teacher organized a weekend field trip into the nearby Selkirk Mountains. Emily joined reluctantly, expecting boredom, discomfort, and forced social interaction. Instead, she found something she had never felt before: space. Physical space, mental space. The kind of silence that did not feel judgmental or empty, but vast and neutral. The mountains did not care how she looked. They did not ask questions. They simply existed. That weekend changed her trajectory. She began hiking alone whenever she could, first on well-marked trails, then deeper into less traveled terrain. She learned to read topographic maps, to track weather systems, to understand how quickly conditions could shift at elevation. She respected the risks, but she did not fear them. Fear to Emily was something different. Fear was noise, fear was crowds, fear was the pressure of expectations and explanations. The wilderness stripped all of that away. By her mid-20s, Emily had structured her entire life around that principle. Freelance work gave her flexibility. She took contracts when she needed money and disappeared into the mountains when she did not. Friends admired her dedication but rarely followed her. Her hikes grew longer, more technical, more remote. She documented them occasionally on social media, but never for attention. The posts were sparse, almost clinical. Photos of ridgelines, trailheads, boots resting on granite, rarely herself. When she did appear in frame, it was usually from behind, a small figure against something immense. The scar and tattoo made her recognizable, but she never highlighted them. Daniel Brooks entered her life during this phase. They met in a climbing gym on a rainy Tuesday evening. Daniel was careful with his movements, precise in a way that reflected his engineering background. Emily noticed immediately. Most climbers rushed routes, muscling through problems. Daniel paused, planned, measured. They spoke briefly that night, then again the following week. Their connection developed slowly, without drama, built on shared respect rather than intensity. Daniel admired Emily's independence, but he also saw its cost. Where Emily found peace in solitude, Daniel found comfort in structure and predictability. He liked schedules. He liked knowing where people were, when they would be back, what the plan was. Emily's solo hikes unsettled him, not because he doubted her ability, but because he understood probability. He knew how small margins could become in the mountains. Their conversations about risk were never arguments. They were quiet negotiations. Emily listened. Daniel learned when to stop pressing. Neither tried to change the other completely. Thompson Peak, however, tested that balance. When Emily first mentioned it, Daniel felt an immediate tightening in his chest. The peak was not infamous, but it was respected. He had read reports. He knew about the route-finding challenges near the summit, the loose talus, the steep west-facing slopes that dropped into complex drainages with limited visibility. He suggested going together, or with friends. Emily smiled, kissed his cheek, and said she would see how she felt. She researched the route obsessively in the weeks leading up to the hike. Satellite imagery, trip reports, seasonal snow conditions, weather models. She marked possible descent options on her map, including alternate routes that avoided reclimbing certain sections. Daniel watched her prepare and tried to quiet his unease. 2 days before the hike, she posted online. Not dramatically, not as a declaration. Just information. Thompson Peak, solo, not beginner-friendly, room in the car if anyone wanted to join. No one responded. Emily did not seem disappointed. The night before she left, they ate dinner together at home. Nothing special, pasta, a shared bottle of wine. They talked about mundane things, Work deadlines, a leaky faucet, plans for a short trip later in the fall. Daniel considered bringing up his concerns again. He didn't. He had learned that Emily's decisions, once made, were not impulsive. They were quiet conclusions she arrived at alone. On the morning she left, she moved with the efficiency of routine: coffee, gear check, boots laced carefully. She paused at the door longer than usual, leaned back and hugged Daniel tightly. It was not a farewell. It did not feel like one. That detail would haunt him later. At the trailhead, Emily signed her name in the register with steady handwriting. Time, destination, solo. Search and rescue teams would later study that signature closely. It was not rushed. It was not hesitant. It looked exactly like the handwriting of someone who expected to return. As Emily climbed higher, witnesses remembered her calm demeanor. She was not rushing. She was not distracted. She appeared focused, comfortable, fully in control of her movement and choices. Nothing about her behavior suggested distress. And yet, by mid-afternoon, something shifted. When she reached the summit area, she lingered longer than most hikers. She sat among the rocks, eating slowly, watching clouds drift across the peaks. She spoke briefly with others, but did not mention her descent plan. One hiker later recalled her studying the western slopes intently. Another remembered her asking a vague question about what lay beyond the ridgeline. These were small details, innocent, even, but they would become central to every theory that followed. Emily had always believed that the mountains rewarded awareness, that if you paid attention, truly paid attention, you could move through them safely. What she did not account for was how quickly confidence could blur into miscalculation, and how unforgiving the margin between the two could be. When she stood up and shouldered her pack, she did not head back the way she came. She walked west. Emily Carter reached the Iron Creek trailhead just after 9 in the morning. The gravel parking area was already warming under the August sun, the air carrying the faint metallic smell of dust and pine sap. A thin haze from distant wildfires softened the sky into a pale gray blue, dulling the sharp edges of the surrounding peaks. Visibility was good but not perfect. Distances felt deceptive, ridgelines blending into one another farther out. She parked near the far edge of the lot, away from the other vehicles, and sat for a moment with the engine off. Witnesses would later recall seeing her there, checking her phone one last time before slipping it into her pack. There was no rush in her movements, no visible anxiety. She signed the trail register at 9:14 a.m. Name, destination, solo. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate. Search and rescue teams would later photograph the page, enlarging the image, studying it as if it might reveal something more than ink on paper. But it didn't. It showed only intention. Emily adjusted her pack, extended her trekking poles, and stepped onto the trail. The first section climbed gradually through dense forest. Fir and lodgepole pine blocked most of the sunlight, trapping pockets of cool air along the creek crossings. The trail was narrow but well-defined, winding upward in long switchbacks that hid the elevation gain. Several hikers passed her during this stretch. Later interviews painted a consistent picture. She was polite, reserved, but friendly when spoken to. She asked one group how conditions looked higher up. She warned another pair that the route was more technical near the summit than it appeared on maps. She sounded like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. By late morning, Emily reached the upper basin, where trees thinned and the landscape opened into rock and alpine grass. The temperature rose quickly once the shade disappeared. Sweat darkened the straps of her backpack. She stopped briefly near a stream to refill water, kneeling carefully on a flat stone, moving with practiced efficiency. A hiker resting nearby noticed the scar on her neck when she leaned forward. He would remember it clearly. Later, when authorities asked, above the basin, the trail became less obvious. Loose talus replaced packed dirt. Cairns marked sections of the route, but they were spaced unevenly, sometimes disappearing altogether. This was where most hikers slowed down, concentrating on foot placement, choosing lines instinctively rather than following anything that resembled a path. Emily thrived in this terrain. Witnesses recalled seeing her moving confidently across the rocks, testing holds, adjusting her weight, never hesitating for long. She did not appear reckless. She did not appear fatigued. She looked focused. At approximately 1:45 p.m., Emily was seen near the final approach to the summit. The air was thinner here, the wind stronger, carrying the faint smell of smoke even at elevation. Clouds drifted low but did not threaten storms. Conditions were stable but deceptive. Sunlight reflected harshly off granite, obscuring depth and making slopes appear less steep than they truly were. between 2 and 3 o'clock, multiple hikers independently confirmed that Emily reached the summit area. One group shared a brief lunch with her among the rocks. They talked about the views, about how far the smoke had traveled, about other peaks they hoped to climb later in the season. Emily removed her pack, stretched her shoulders, and ate slowly. Nothing about her behavior suggested urgency. Another hiker remembered her sitting alone slightly apart from the others, legs dangling over a flat slab of stone staring westward. He thought at the time that she looked peaceful, almost contemplative. It was during this window that something subtle but critical occurred. Several witnesses recalled Emily asking vague questions about what lay beyond the summit ridge. She did not ask directly about a route, but about terrain, about how steep it was, about whether anyone had gone down that side before. These questions were not alarming on their own. Experienced hikers often explore alternative descents, sometimes to avoid reclimbing steep sections, sometimes simply out of curiosity. And Thompson Peak, while challenging, does not present an obvious single path near the top. Still, those questions would later become a focal point. The standard descent retraces the ascent route, leading back into the basin and eventually to Iron Creek. It is the safest option, not because it is easy, but because it is known. The western side of the mountain is different. It drops more abruptly. Slopes are looser. Drainages twist into complex gullies that funnel downward toward remote valleys with limited access and poor visibility from above. Maps show little detail there, just contour lines tightening sharply, a warning in themselves. Sometime around 3:10 p.m., Emily stood up, adjusted her pack, and prepared to descend. One hiker watched her shoulder her gear and start moving, and this is where the accounts diverge. At least 2 witnesses told investigators they were surprised by the direction she chose. Instead of heading back toward the basin, Emily moved west, stepping carefully across angled granite slabs, away from the familiar route. One hiker recalled feeling uneasy but said nothing. He assumed she knew something he didn't. Another lost sight of her after a few minutes as she dropped below a ridgeline. That was the last confirmed sighting of Emily Carter. Back in Boise, Daniel Brooks was finishing his workday. Emily had told him she might not be back at the car until early evening. He expected a message sometime around 6 or 7. He checked his phone casually at first, distracted by meetings and emails. By 6:30, he noticed the silence. By 7, the silence felt heavy. Daniel tried calling her phone. It went straight to voicemail. This, on its own, was not unusual. Cell service in the Sawtooths is inconsistent at best. Emily had warned him about that countless times, but Daniel knew there were occasional reception pockets near the summit and along the standard descent. He waited. At 8, he tried again. Nothing. As darkness crept across the mountains, Daniel's unease sharpened into something more visceral. He replayed their last conversation in his mind. The way she had lingered at the door, the way she had hugged him just a moment longer than usual. By 9 o'clock, he made a decision he would later second-guess endlessly. He grabbed his keys and drove toward the mountains. Daniel Brooks reached the Iron Creek trailhead a little after 10:30 that night. By then, the mountains were completely dark. There were no lights anywhere near the parking area. No ranger station. No cell service. Just a wide gravel lot swallowed by shadow, the outlines of trees barely visible against a sky dulled by smoke and cloud. His headlights swept across parked vehicles one by one, until they landed on a familiar shape at the far edge of the lot. Emily's car was still there. It sat exactly where she had left it that morning, angled slightly toward the trees, a thin layer of dust already settling on the windshield. The sight brought Daniel a brief, confusing sense of relief. Her car being there meant she hadn't driven off with someone else. It meant she hadn't simply changed plans and forgotten to tell him, but it also meant something else. It meant she hadn't come back. Daniel parked beside it and stepped out into the cool night air. The temperature had dropped sharply since sunset. The silence felt unnatural, heavy in a way he could feel in his chest. He stood there for several seconds, scanning the trailhead as if expecting Emily to emerge from the darkness at any moment, headlamp glowing, annoyed that he had worried. She didn't. Daniel opened the trunk of his car and pulled out a small flashlight he had bought at a gas station on the drive up. It was cheap and lightweight, barely adequate for a sidewalk, let alone a mountain trail. At the time, he told himself he would only hike a short distance, just enough to see if she was close, maybe dealing with a twisted ankle or a dead phone battery. He did not leave a note. He did not call authorities. At that moment, he still believed this was a delay, not a disappearance. The trail vanished almost immediately beyond the reach of the parking lot. Daniel clicked on the flashlight and stepped into the forest, the beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the darkness. Shadows shifted with every movement, trees and rocks appearing closer than they were, then dissolving again as he passed. The trail that had been straightforward in daylight felt hostile at night. Roots caught at his boots. Loose stones shifted unexpectedly underfoot. The creek crossings, gentle hours earlier, now sounded louder, more aggressive, water rushing unseen just beyond the beam of light. Daniel called Emily's name periodically, his voice sounding smaller than he expected, swallowed quickly by the forest. He pushed upward faster than he should have. Adrenaline masked fatigue. Fear narrowed his focus. He told himself that if he could just reach the basin, if he could just see the open terrain, everything would make sense. It didn't. As he climbed higher, the trail grew steeper, rockier. His flashlight flickered briefly, then steadied. He adjusted his grip, frustration rising. The battery indicator on his phone glowed dimly. He resisted the urge to keep checking it, knowing he needed the power. Somewhere above the basin, Daniel slipped. His foot skidded on loose gravel, and he went down hard, slamming his hand against a rock. The flashlight flew from his grip and struck the ground with a sharp crack. When he retrieved it, the casing was shattered. The beam sputtered once, then went dark. For several seconds, Daniel stood frozen, breathing hard, the darkness absolute around him. He turned on his phone's flashlight. The weak, pale glow barely illuminated the ground at his feet. Everything beyond a few yards dissolved into shadow. That was the moment he understood how dangerous his decision had been. Continuing upward like this was reckless. Turning back meant admitting what he had been trying not to say out loud since he arrived. Emily was not just late. Something had gone wrong. Daniel stood there, alone on the mountain, weighing the risk of moving forward against the certainty of what would happen if he slipped again. The forest offered no guidance, no sound, no sign of her. He turned around. The hike back down was slower, more deliberate. He moved carefully, using his phone light sparingly, stopping often to orient himself. Every snapped twig made him flinch. Every shadow felt like a presence just beyond his vision. When he finally emerged back into the parking lot, his legs were trembling. Emily's car was still there, untouched, silent. Daniel leaned against his own vehicle, his hands shaking as the weight of the situation settled fully into place. He tried calling Emily one more time, straight to voicemail. There was no cell service. He climbed into his car and drove. He did not know how far he would have to go before he could make a call. The road wound downward through the forest, twisting away from the trailhead, disappearing into darkness. Minutes stretched painfully. His phone remained useless. Then, unexpectedly, headlights illuminated a small sign ahead, a ranger station. The building was dark, closed for the night, but a single payphone was mounted on the exterior wall. Daniel pulled over abruptly, nearly skidding on the gravel, and ran toward it. His hands fumbled with the receiver as he dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Daniel struggled to keep his voice steady. He explained who he was, where Emily had gone, when she was supposed to be back, that she was experienced, that she was alone, that her car was still at the trailhead. There was a pause on the line. Then the dispatcher told him to stay where he was. Within the hour, Daniel was sitting inside the ranger station, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, staring at a map spread across a metal table. A search and rescue coordinator pointed to Thompson Peak, tracing potential routes with a pen, his expression tightening as Daniel described the witnesses who had seen Emily head west. By the time dawn broke over the Sawtooths, Emily Carter was officially missing, and the mountain was about to give nothing back. The first search teams reached the Iron Creek trailhead just after sunrise. The light revealed what darkness had concealed the night before. Thompson Peak rose sharply above the basin, its granite faces catching the early sun in pale orange bands. Smoke still hung in the air, thinner than the day before but persistent enough to soften the outlines of the ridges. The mountain looked calm, indifferent. Search and rescue vehicles lined the gravel lot in quiet efficiency. Volunteers checked radios, shouldered packs, adjusted helmets. A helicopter crew warmed their engine farther down the road, the rhythmic thump of blades echoing faintly through the trees. Daniel Brooks stood off to the side, watching it all unfold as if from a distance. He had not slept. His eyes burned, his thoughts looping endlessly back to the same moments, the unanswered calls, the broken flashlight, the direction Emily had chosen. A search coordinator approached him with a clipboard and a measured tone. She asked him to describe Emily's gear in detail. Clothing colors, backpack size, footwear, any distinctive items she might have carried. Daniel answered automatically. Dark pack. Gray pants. Tank top. Trekking poles. Scar on her neck. Tattoo on her shoulder. Every detail felt suddenly enormous. By mid-morning, the search was fully underway. Ground teams moved up the standard route first, following the trail Emily had taken the day before. They scanned for footprints, broken branches, anything out of place. Dogs were brought in to scent from Emily's car, then guided carefully along the trail, handlers watching their behavior closely for subtle changes. Above them, the helicopter lifted off. Its path traced the upper slopes of Thompson Peak, hovering along cliff bands, circling drainages, scanning for heat signatures with forward-looking infrared cameras. Pilots leaned toward open doors, eyes trained on the terrain below, searching for the smallest anomaly, a flash of color, an unnatural shape, anything that suggested human presence. They found nothing. As the hours passed, the search expanded. Climbers were deployed to steeper sections, moving carefully along exposed faces where a fall would have been fatal. Rangers checked known hazard areas, snowfields that lingered year-round, steep gullies where loose rock could funnel a person downward, and the mouths of old mine shafts scattered across the mountain. The mines were among the most troubling features. Many were unmarked, some were partially collapsed, hidden beneath brush and shadow. Others dropped vertically, invisible, until you were nearly on top of them. Entering each one was dangerous, requiring specialized equipment and risking secondary collapse. Teams marked locations, peered inside when safe, documented what they could. Nothing. By afternoon, divers were called in to search the smaller alpine lakes below the summit. Cold, dark water swallowed visibility after just a few feet. They descended methodically, sweeping the bottoms with practiced movements, feeling blindly along submerged rock. They surfaced empty-handed. Daniel moved between the search teams like a ghost. He answered questions when asked. He stood where they told him to stand. He watched the mountain through binoculars until his eyes ached. Occasionally, he felt a surge of irrational hope, a belief that Emily would emerge from the trees, exhausted but alive. Annoyed at the attention, each hour without news eroded that belief further. Late in the day, the search coordinator gathered the team leaders. Maps were spread across the hood of a vehicle. Routes were traced again, witness statements revisited. The fact that Emily had been seen heading west dominated the conversation. That side of the mountain was more complex, more dangerous, and far harder to search effectively. Steep terrain limited where helicopters could safely fly. Dense gullies blocked line of sight. Ground teams would need time measured in days, not hours. Daniel listened as they discussed probabilities. If Emily had fallen, she could be anywhere along those slopes. If she had been injured but mobile, she might have descended into a drainage, following water downhill, moving farther from the trail with every step. If she had entered a mine shaft, there might be no visible evidence at all. Each scenario felt worse than the last. As evening approached, volunteers began caching supplies along likely routes. Brightly colored bags were secured near junctions and sheltered areas, stocked with food, socks, and handwritten notes. If you find this, stay here. Help is coming. The idea that Emily might stumble across one of those bags in the dark sustained a fragile hope. Night fell again. The helicopter was grounded, visibility dropped. Teams regrouped at the trailhead, exhausted, dust-covered, quiet. No gear had been found, no footprints that could be conclusively tied to Emily, no sign that she had fallen, climbed, or rested anywhere on the mountain. Daniel sat on the tailgate of a truck, staring at Thompson Peak as the last light drained from its face. The search had thrown everything it reasonably could at the mountain. The mountain had returned nothing. Over the next several days, the operation only grew. Additional teams arrived from neighboring counties. More climbers, more dogs, more equipment. Each morning began with briefings, maps, assignments. Each evening ended the same way, with no answers. The terrain fought back relentlessly. Loose rock shifted under boots. Steep slopes slowed progress to a crawl. Smoke thickened again as winds shifted, grounding aircraft for hours at a time. The mountain dictated the pace, not the people searching it. By the end of the first week, exhaustion set in. Volunteers rotated in and out, faces drawn, movements mechanical. Search leaders recalculated probabilities again and again, expanding grids, narrowing focus, then expanding once more. Emily Carter remained missing. After 12 days, the tone shifted subtly. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it was understood. Survivability windows were closing. The search continued, but the urgency carried a different weight now. Less expectation of rescue, more obligation to recover. Daniel felt the shift immediately. He heard it in the phrasing of briefings, saw it in the careful way questions were asked. By day 18, the mountain had been searched extensively, but not completely. It never could be. When the county officially suspended active operations on the 22nd day, the announcement was delivered carefully, respectfully. Resources had been exhausted, conditions were deteriorating. The risk to searchers was increasing. There was still no sign of Emily. Daniel stood with the search coordinator as she explained a decision, her voice steady, professional, apologetic. The mountain behind her was unchanged. Emily Carter had gone into it alone, and it had not let her come back. When official search operations ended, the silence did not. It simply changed shape. The mountain no longer echoed with helicopter blades or shouted names, but the absence left behind was louder than anything that had come before. The Iron Creek trailhead returned to its normal stillness, yet Emily Carter's disappearance had already escaped the wilderness and entered something far more chaotic, public attention. Within hours of the county's announcement, news articles began to circulate beyond Idaho. Headlines framed Emily as an experienced solo hiker who had vanished without a trace. Photographs taken from her social media accounts, mostly landscapes, a few candid images of her smiling beside alpine lakes, were shared again and again, stripped of context, turned into symbols. The questions followed immediately. How could someone so experienced simply disappear? Why was she alone? Why had she chosen that route? And inevitably, the questions turned inward. Daniel Brooks became the focal point almost overnight. At first, the attention felt supportive. Reporters asked about Emily's love of the outdoors, her discipline, her careful planning. Daniel answered patiently, repeating the same details until they lost meaning. He spoke about her confidence, her preparation, her independence, but as days passed without new information, the tone shifted. Online forums began dissecting timelines. Comment sections filled with speculation. People who had never met Emily or Daniel reconstructed her final day with absolute certainty, drawing conclusions from fragments and assumptions. Someone pointed out that Daniel had not contacted authorities immediately. Someone else noted that he had gone up the trail alone at night. A few questioned the authenticity of his concern, his calm demeanor during interviews, the way he described Emily using the word partner instead of girlfriend in one article, the love of my life in another. Grief, to strangers, never looks correct. Daniel tried to stay offline, but the noise found him anyway. Friends sent screenshots. Family members called, alarmed by rumors they barely understood. Each theory chipped away at what little emotional stability he had left. Then came the phone ping. On the fourth day after official operations ended, law enforcement received a report that Emily Carter's phone had briefly connected to a cell tower. Not near Thompson Peak, but over 100 miles away, in downtown Boise. For a moment, hope surged violently. Could she have made it out? Could her phone have been dead, then charged somewhere? Could she have been injured, disoriented, found by someone and brought back to civilization? The news spread instantly. Daniel was called in for questioning again. Officers were careful, neutral, but their attention was sharper now. He explained again that Emily's phone had been with her, that she had not returned home, that he had no explanation for the ping. It took several hours for the truth to emerge. The signal had not come from Emily's phone at all. In a desperate attempt to access cloud data, photos, backups, location history, Daniel's mother had worked with the service provider to authenticate Emily's account on her own device. The system had temporarily mirrored the phone's identifier, causing the network to register activity where there was none. A technical error, a false lead. The hope collapsed as quickly as it had formed, leaving something worse behind. Confusion, distrust, embarrassment. And for some observers, suspicion hardened instead of fading. Why clone the phone? What was being accessed? Why was Daniel's family involved so closely? The questions were relentless. Emily's parents, who lived several states away, began to withdraw from public communication. Her mother stopped answering calls from reporters entirely. Privately, she expressed frustration at the search, at the lack of answers, at Daniel. Grief fractured relationships that had once been united by a single goal. Daniel felt it acutely. He returned to work briefly, only to find himself unable to focus. Emails blurred. Meetings passed without memory. He spent nights replaying maps in his head, tracing the western slopes of Thompson Peak again and again, searching for a detail everyone else might have missed. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams, when they arrived, were vivid and disorienting. Emily standing just out of reach, a voice echoing from below a ridgeline, a flashlight beam cutting through smoke and finding nothing. Despite the scrutiny, Daniel refused to stop searching. He contacted private search groups. He spoke with former rescue professionals. He learned the names of terrain features most hikers never noticed: drainages, benches, cliff bands. He taped maps to the walls of their apartment, marking areas that had not been fully searched due to risk or weather. Friends worried about him. Some urged him to let go, to accept that the mountain might never give answers. Others quietly distanced themselves, uncomfortable with his fixation, unsure how to support something that no longer looked resolvable. Daniel did not blame them. What surprised him more was the hostility from strangers. Anonymous messages arrived daily. Some accused him outright, others offered unsolicited theories, psychic readings, detailed narratives that ignored reality entirely. A few messages were kind, expressing hope, sharing stories of survival against impossible odds. Those were the ones he read again and again. In the absence of evidence, imagination filled the void, and the wilderness, silent as ever, offered no corrections. As winter approached, snow began to fall in the sawtooths, sealing the mountain under layers of white that erased whatever traces might still exist. Access routes closed, search windows narrowed to nothing. Emily Carter's disappearance became something else entirely, a mystery, and mysteries once formed rarely stay contained. Daniel Brooks did not stop searching when winter arrived. He adjusted. As snow closed the upper routes and locked Thompson Peak behind ice and wind, Daniel shifted his focus from movement to planning. He spent long nights at the apartment surrounded by maps taped to the walls, cross-referencing satellite imagery with search logs, reading technical reports written by climbers who knew the sawtooths intimately. He learned the language of the mountain in a different way now, not as a hiker, but as someone trying to reconstruct absence. It was during this period that he was introduced to Marcus Hale. Hale was not affiliated with any county agency. He was not a ranger, and he was not welcomed by most official search and rescue teams. His background was a mixture of legitimate experience and controversy. Former military, self-trained in wilderness tracking, known for entering areas others avoided. He had helped recover missing hikers before, sometimes years after official searches ended. Critics called him reckless. Supporters called him relentless. Daniel didn't care what people called him. Their first conversation was brief and direct. Hale asked Daniel what direction Emily had taken off the summit. When Daniel said west, Hale paused longer than expected. He asked about old mining activity in that drainage, about seasonal snow bridges, about cliff bands that never saw sunlight. Daniel realized quickly that Hale was not thinking about where Emily should have gone. He was thinking about where someone might disappear. Together they began to plan an unofficial operation. They called it nothing at first, just the search. Later, as volunteers trickled in, friends of friends, climbers, locals who knew the terrain, it gained a name out of necessity, a way to organize files, emails, requests. Daniel didn't like the name, but he accepted it. The work began quietly. Drones were tested in legal airspace. Cameras with long-range lenses scanned slopes inaccessible on foot. Hale coordinated with climbers willing to enter dangerous zones that official teams had marked as too risky. They documented everything: photographs, GPS tracks, timestamps, not because they expected to find Emily alive, but because they believed the mountain still held evidence. The friction with authorities was immediate. County officials warned Daniel about liability, about risk, about the dangers of winter exploration. Hale was explicitly barred from certain areas due to prior incidents. Daniel listened, nodded, thanked them, and continued anyway. From the outside, it looked obsessive. From the inside, it felt necessary. Snow fell steadily as December turned to January. The sawtooths became hostile, even to experienced mountaineers. Avalanches swept familiar slopes. Wind sculpted drifts into unpredictable traps. Visibility dropped to nothing without warning. The search slowed, then paused entirely. Daniel stayed behind. He hiked lower elevations when weather allowed. He walked creek beds where snow thinned, scanning for anything unnatural. A scrap of fabric, a glint of metal, a break in the pattern of stones. He found nothing, but each pass taught him more about how the land moved, how water and gravity shaped what remained visible. It was exhausting, physically, emotionally. Friends urged him to stop. His parents flew in and sat with him late into the night, gently suggesting that rest did not mean surrender. Daniel listened, nodded, and returned to the maps as soon as they slept. What haunted him most were the unanswered questions. Why had Emily gone west? She had planned carefully. She had researched. She had known the standard descent. Every theory Daniel constructed eventually collided with that fact. Hale offered possibilities: a navigational misjudgment caused by smoke and glare, a desire to avoid reclimbing loose sections, curiosity, overconfidence, or something unexpected, a perceived shortcut, a terrain feature that looked manageable from above and revealed its danger too late. Each possibility ended the same way: one wrong step. As spring approached, the snowpack began to recede unevenly. South-facing slopes exposed rock early. Shadows still held ice. Hale returned, pushing to resume the search the moment conditions allowed. They focused on areas that had remained inaccessible during the official operation: narrow gullies, overhung cliff bands, drainages that funneled debris downward and buried it. Climbers descended on ropes, moving slowly, methodically, scanning ledges and cracks where a person might be hidden from view above. Drones flew patterns that mirrored water flow, not trails. Still, nothing. The absence became its own presence. Online, interest flared again as Hale posted updates. Videos of steep terrain, commentary about missed zones. His tone was confident, sometimes confrontational. It drew attention and criticism. Some accused him of exploiting Emily's disappearance. Others accused Daniel of clinging to false hope. Comment sections fractured into camps, arguing not about what had happened, but about who was allowed to search. Daniel ignored most of it. He focused instead on what Hale showed him one afternoon in early June. A series of photographs taken from a drone pass over a western drainage. At first glance there was nothing unusual: rock, shadow, snow remnants clinging to crevices. Then Hale zoomed in on a specific section: a faint line, a disturbance in the talus that didn't follow natural fall patterns. Stones displaced in a way that suggested movement, not erosion. It wasn't definitive, it wasn't proof, but it was the first thing in months that didn't feel like nothing. They returned to the site on foot days later. Access was difficult. The slope was unstable, the approach exposed. Climbers anchored lines and moved carefully, communicating in short bursts. Daniel waited above, watching, heart pounding with each minute that passed. They found no body, no clothing, but they did find a trekking pole. It was damaged, bent near the middle, partially buried beneath rock. The grip was worn smooth. The brand matched Emily's. The serial number was unreadable. Authorities were notified immediately. The site was documented, photographed, secured as best as possible. The discovery reignited everything: hope, fear, scrutiny. Was it hers? Had it been carried there by snowmelt, rockfall, human movement? No one could say with certainty, but it was no longer nothing. Daniel stood at the edge of the slope long after the others had packed up. Wind moved across the drainage, whispering through stone and brush. He imagined Emily there, injured but alive, calling for help that never came. He imagined her slipping silently into a place no one could see. The mountain offered no answers, only space for imagination to run unchecked. As summer deepened, the unofficial search continued in fits and starts. Progress was slow, risk remained high. Hale pushed boundaries, Daniel followed. Neither of them knew it yet, but the search for Emily Carter was about to intersect with another disappearance, on another mountain, years later. And what Daniel would find there would change the shape of his search forever. The call came nearly 4 years after Emily Carter vanished. By then, Daniel Brooks no longer reacted to his phone the way he once had. He had learned the cost of hope. He let calls ring longer now. He listened more than he spoke. When he agreed to help search for someone else, it was never because he believed the ending would be different. It was because he knew what it meant when the search stopped. The missing woman's name was Hannah Lowe. She was 32, an experienced backcountry hiker who disappeared in late October of 2020 while attempting a solo overnight route in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. Like Emily, she had planned carefully. Like Emily, she had been seen near the summit, and like Emily, she never returned to her vehicle. The similarities were impossible to ignore. County search and rescue teams worked the area for 10 days. Snow arrived early that year, heavier than expected. Helicopters were grounded. Ground teams were pulled back. The official search was suspended quietly, without ceremony. Daniel recognized the language immediately. He joined the private effort without hesitation. Marcus Hale was already there. The bitter roots were different from the sawtooths, less open, more claustrophobic. Dense timber choked the lower slopes. Steep ravines dropped suddenly, hidden beneath layers of deadfall and brush. Old logging roads cut through the area like scars, many leading nowhere. The terrain swallowed sound. The team moved methodically, focusing on zones overlooked during the official operation, slopes beneath cliff bands, drainages that funneled debris, areas where a fall might not leave obvious surface evidence. Daniel had learned to search differently now. He no longer scanned for bodies. He scanned for interruption, patterns that didn't belong, places where the landscape felt disturbed in subtle ways. It was late afternoon on the 12th day when it happened. Daniel had stepped away from the main group to rest near a large boulder at the edge of a narrow clearing. He sat down heavily, pulled off his gloves, and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. The habit had crept in over the years, replacing sleep, replacing rest. As he exhaled, his eyes drifted downhill. That was when he saw it. A rectangle of color that did not exist anywhere else in the forest. It was faint, partially obscured by brush, but it was unmistakably synthetic, too straight, too bright, too deliberate to be natural. Daniel stood slowly, heart accelerating despite his efforts to stay calm. He lifted his radio. "What color was Hannah's sleeping pad?" he asked, keeping his voice even. There was a pause. Then someone answered, "Blue, dark blue." Daniel's gaze never left the object. Marcus Hale came on the channel next, his voice low and precise. "She also carried an orange foam sit pad," Hale said, "folded, usually strapped outside the pack." Daniel felt the ground tilt beneath him. The rectangle was orange. He moved downhill carefully, each step deliberate, afraid of disturbing the scene. The closer he got, the more details emerged. The pad was folded neatly, wedged against a rock as if placed intentionally. Nearby, half hidden beneath pine needles, was a backpack, blue. The zipper was partially open. Inside were items laid out with a strange order, extra layers, food wrappers, a headlamp with dead batteries. A pair of trekking poles leaned against a tree, crossed at the handles. Daniel swallowed hard. A few feet beyond the pack, he saw the boots, and then, behind a fallen log, he saw her. Hannah Lowe's hair was matted, her clothing torn by weather and time. She lay on her side, partially covered by debris, her body preserved unevenly by cold and shade. There were no obvious signs of trauma from a distance, no blood, no indication of violence, just stillness. Daniel did not move closer. He keyed his radio with hands that barely felt real. "I've got her," he said. The words landed heavily in the quiet forest. Search protocol took over immediately. Coordinates were logged, the area was secured, authorities were notified. The team stepped back, allowing professionals to approach. Daniel remained where he was, staring at the ground. He did not cry, not then. Later, investigators would determine that Hannah had likely slipped while descending an icy slope, sliding into the trees below and suffering fatal injuries. Her gear placement suggested she had attempted to stabilize herself, possibly even survive the initial fall, arranging her equipment before succumbing to exposure. It was a tragic but comprehensible ending, an ending Emily had never been given. When Daniel returned home weeks later, the silence felt different. He had helped a family find answers. He had given them a place to grieve, a truth to hold on to instead of endless speculation. But the relief he expected never came. Instead, the discovery carved something deeper inside him. Because if Hannah Lowe could be found, years later, in terrain just as unforgiving, then Emily could be somewhere too, waiting, or hidden. The mountain had not erased her, it had only delayed the truth. Daniel returned to the maps once again, tracing old lines with new eyes. He marked Hannah's location relative to last sightings, to water flow, to terrain traps. Patterns began to emerge, and one of them led him back, inevitably, to Thompson Peak, the western slopes, the drainages no one wanted to search again, the places that swallow mistakes whole. Daniel did not know what he would find there, only that he could no longer stop looking. Daniel Brooks returned to Thompson Peak in late summer of 2022. By then, the mountain felt less like a place and more like a question that refused to fade. He did not come alone this time. Marcus Hale was with him again, along with two climbers who had spent decades navigating unstable alpine terrain. They moved carefully, deliberately, as if the mountain itself were listening. This was not a rescue attempt. It was not even a search in the traditional sense. It was an audit. Every assumption that had guided the original operation was revisited, every decision re-examined. Daniel no longer asked where Emily might have gone. He asked where she could have gone, and where no one would ever see her again. The western slopes of Thompson Peak were worse than he remembered. From above, they looked deceptively manageable. Angled granite broken by shelves of talus, interrupted by narrow gullies that funneled downward into shadow. But once committed, retreat became complicated. The rock shifted constantly beneath their weight. A misjudged step sent stones skittering hundreds of feet below, their sound echoing long after they vanished from sight. Hale stopped often, pointing out features invisible from maps alone. Snowmotes, where lingering ice pulled away from rock faces, leaving deep vertical gaps hidden beneath thin crusts. Seasonal traps that appeared solid until weight was applied. A person stepping into one would vanish instantly, swallowed into darkness without leaving a visible trace above. Then there were the mines. The sawtooths had been heavily worked in the late 19th century. Prospectors bored into the mountains with little concern for long-term stability, leaving behind shafts that were never properly sealed. Some entrances were obvious, timbers framing dark mouths in cliff walls. Others were nothing more than holes concealed by brush, collapses, or snow. Hale marked each one they found. They did not enter most of them. Some dropped straight down, others angled inward before branching unpredictably. Many were unstable, their supports long since rotted away. A single vibration could trigger collapse. Daniel stood at the edge of one shaft and felt the same hollow sensation he had experienced years earlier in the Bitterroots. The understanding that some places do not return what they take. They moved lower, following drainages that cut sharply away from the summit. These channels told stories if you knew how to read them. Rockfall scars, vegetation bent downhill, patterns of debris that indicated how water and gravity behaved during storms and snowmelt. If Emily had fallen and remained mobile even briefly, instinct might have guided her downhill. Humans follow water. It feels logical. It feels survivable. But these drainages did not lead gently outward. They ended in steep drops, choke points, and blind bends where debris piled deep. A body could be buried completely within a single season, covered by rock, snow, and organic matter. By the time spring arrived, there would be nothing to distinguish one slope from another. Daniel asked questions constantly. Would gear survive a fall like this? Could bright colors still be visible years later? Would metal shift downhill, or lodge in place? The answers were never absolute. Sometimes gear stayed near the point of impact. Sometimes it traveled astonishing distances. Sometimes it disappeared entirely, buried or carried away by meltwater. Sometimes it emerged years later, exposed by erosion, only to be overlooked again. The mountain did not operate by rules that favored discovery. As they climbed back toward the summit late in the day, Daniel paused where witnesses had last seen Emily. He stood exactly where she might have stood, looking west into the maze of stone and shadow. From that vantage point, the decision made sense. The western route appeared direct, clean, less cluttered than the ascent path. From above, it promised efficiency. A way down without retracing difficult ground. It was only once committed that the illusion broke. Hale spoke quietly beside him. People think experience protects them, he said. It doesn't. It just gets them farther before something goes wrong. They stayed until the light began to fail, scanning one final gully that dropped out of sight just beyond a ridge. Nothing caught their attention. No unnatural color, no interruption, no answers. On the hike down, Daniel felt a familiar resignation settle in. Not despair, but something colder and more stable. Acceptance without closure. That night, back at the trailhead, he sat alone beside Emily's old parking spot. Cars came and went. Headlamps flickered along the trail. Life continued, indifferent and uninterrupted. Daniel understood now what had made Emily's case so enduring. It was not that she vanished inexplicably. It was that she vanished plausibly. Every theory fit, and none of them could be proven. A fall into a snow moat, a slide into a drainage, a misstep into a mine shaft. A chain of small decisions that never allowed correction. The wilderness did not need malice. It only needed indifference. As the years passed, Daniel stopped framing Emily's disappearance as a mystery waiting to be solved. He began to see it as a reality shaped by terrain, timing, and probability. Some people leave questions behind instead of answers. Thompson Peak would never confess, and that, Daniel realized, was the hardest truth of all. Years have passed since Emily Carter walked away from the summit of Thompson Peak. The trail register still sits in a metal box at Iron Creek, its pages filled with names that came and went without consequence. Hikers continue to sign in. They shoulder packs, adjust straps, and disappear upward into the same terrain Emily once crossed with confidence. Most of them return by nightfall. Some don't. The mountain does not distinguish between them. Emily's case remains officially open. No remains have been recovered. No definitive evidence has surfaced. Over time, her disappearance has been quietly reclassified, not as a mystery demanding resolution, but as an unsolved wilderness loss, a category that requires no villain, no final explanation, just terrain, just probability. Daniel Brooks still hikes, though not the way he once did. He no longer chases summits. He prefers lower routes now, wide valleys where sightlines stretch far and mistakes feel survivable. When he passes trailheads, he notices the small details most people ignore: the warning signs, the weathered memorial plaques, the handwritten notes taped to information boards. Occasionally, he sees someone hiking alone. He never says anything. He understands the impulse too well. Emily Carter was not reckless. She was not unprepared. She did not go into the mountains naively. Every official review concluded the same thing. She did what thousands of experienced hikers do every year. She made a choice that appeared reasonable in the moment. That is what makes her disappearance so unsettling. The wilderness does not punish bad people. It does not target the careless exclusively. It operates on margins, small angles, brief lapses, environmental variables that compound without warning. Experience reduces risk, but it never eliminates it. In places like Thompson Peak, the difference between success and erasure can be measured in inches. A step too far onto loose talus, a snow bridge that looks solid from above, a shadow hiding a vertical shaft no one bothered to mark a century ago. There is no sound when it happens that carries far enough to help. There is no signal strong enough to matter. Emily's story has been cited in safety briefings and climbing forums. Some frame it as a cautionary tale about solo hiking. Others argue that fear should not dictate freedom. The debates repeat endlessly, circling the same unanswered questions. Would she have survived with a partner? Would a satellite communicator have changed the outcome? Did she underestimate the route, or did the route mislead her? No conclusion satisfies everyone. Perhaps none should, because reducing Emily Carter to a lesson feels like another kind of disappearance. She was more than the sum of her final decisions. She was a person who found peace where others found noise, who trusted her preparation, who moved through the world deliberately and without spectacle, and she walked into a landscape that does not return explanations. The Sawtooth Wilderness remains unchanged. Snow falls, ice melts, rock shifts imperceptibly, grain by grain. What is hidden stays hidden until conditions decide otherwise. Sometimes they never do. Somewhere on Thompson Peak, or beneath it, or beyond it, Emily Carter's story ended in a way no one witnessed. The mountain absorbed the details, the timeline fractured, and the absence became permanent. That is not a failure of search efforts. It is the nature of places like this. They do not care how much we want answers, and they do not give them simply because we ask.